We're excited to introduce today's visiting author, Larry Börgrin. Mr. Börgrin is an award-winning biographer who currently serves as a featured historian for the History Channel and frequently lectures at major universities and symposiums. His previous work includes profiles of Magellan, Louis Armstrong, Al Capone, Irving Berlin, and James Agee. He's here today to talk to us about his latest endeavor, a biography of Marco Polo.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here today. Marco Polo is a legendary figure to most people, but he was actually, despite some claims to the contrary, over time a real person who did exist and actually did almost everything he wrote about in his book with a few embellishments. It's a kind of compendium of his travels throughout Asia and the Middle East from 1271 to 1294. It was a 24-year odyssey that he started when he was 17 and came back to Venice, where he was from, when he was 41 years old. What I'd like to do, I have a little PowerPoint slideshow about his travels and some pictures which I think will help us get oriented. If you've ever been to Venice, you've seen this famous landmark, which is St. Mark's, and it's the spiritual center of Venice. Anyway, that was a site familiar to young Marco, and this is his house. It's actually a reconstruction of his house. This was just around the corner from where he lived, and a very familiar Venetian scene of gondolas. And you can see how small if you haven't been to Venice, how small the scale of the city is. Just a tiny place with tiny canals and tiny alleyways. So he was used to very cramped confines. This was the view out his front door, and you can see, looking just across the canal, you could practically reach out and touch the boats going by. In his day, these gondolas were built in what was known as the arsenal, the original arsenal, and this was like a precursor of Henry Ford's Model T production line. This was the kind of ship that, which was somewhat larger than the one depicted there, that Marco Polo was on. When he got back to Venice in his early 40s, he was restless, and he spent 2 years. It's not really clear what he was doing, but one of the things he did was lead one of those ships, a galley, into battle against a rival city-state of Genoa. To the best of our knowledge, that's what Marco Polo looked like. There's no portrait of him from life, but this was an early engraving from description, so he might very well have looked like this. In his day, when he was leaving from Venice, people thought the world looked like this. There were cosmologists who had a much different worldview, but they were in the academy, and that was a very rarefied stratum, and they just talked to one another. But the person in the street had a view of the world which was derived from a literal interpretation of the Bible. This is a more accurate idea of the actual Asian continent that they crossed to get to the court of the emperor Kublai Khan, who was the Mongol grandson of Genghis Khan, who had conquered China, and who was then the most powerful ruler in the world. More powerful than any ruler in Europe, more powerful than the Pope. Early in the journey, Marco had to cross a transitional area known as the Pamir Highlands, and this is somewhat east of Afghanistan. He talked about the atmosphere here being so thin that birds couldn't fly, and that you couldn't build a fire. It was very still, very quiet, and very cold because the altitude was so high. He was passing through what we now call the roof of the world. It's near the Himalayas, near Mount Everest. Once they finished crossing this intense cold, they descended to the desert of Taklamakan, and this was again another transitional area, and they traveled on camels. And Marco talks about the caravans and how logically they were organized. The goal of all this traveling, one of the goals was to get to what was the early Mongol capital city. This is a picture I took during my visit there of Karakorum. Anyway, Karakorum, or Harhorum, was the ancient Mongol capital, and it was Kublai Khan who decided to move it to what's now Beijing, both to stake his claim to China and to try and merge the two cultures. when he finally got to Beijing, which took about 6 or 7 years, he was just beginning his adventures. And he had finally met Kublai Khan, got some sense of the grandeur of him. Kublai Khan selected him as his, to be an intelligence agent and tax collector. And when he left, you can see a picture of me on what's now known as the Marco Polo Bridge. If you've ever been to Beijing, you might have walked across this. This bridge existed in Marco's day, and he wrote about it. And it has these very distinctive statues of some sort of cat or lion or monster. So here's a close-up of one of those creatures, supernatural creatures. As Marco walked along, he was basically confronted with empty spaces and with Mongol encampments. As nomads, they really didn't have cities. In fact, they were famous for destroying cities. Kublai Khan was engaged in this experiment in social engineering to try and change the Mongol habit of being a nomad, being nomadic, and to a more pastoral one, like the Chinese, of staying in one place and cultivating land and building cities. It really didn't work, but it was a very interesting experiment. Here's a representation of Kublai Khan. First Yuan emperor, which is what he called his dynasty. Yuan meant origin dynasty. In other words, he wanted to somehow give a sense that history was starting over again with the Mongol conquest of China. Now, here was the kind of thing that Marco was doing during his journey there, which was, you can see, commercial transactions. This is a Western manuscript illumination of a scene from Marco Polo's book where merchants are paying for these. Now, you'll notice they're using coins, but actually in China they used an invention which was unheard of in Europe, paper money. Europe had had paper money for centuries. They had had a form of printing that was like block printing or stenciling. And this was, of course, way advanced over the West. Sometimes they used actual paper that they made from pulp. Sometimes they used silk. Anyway, when Marco got back to Venice many years later, he brought back paper money and said, look at this wonderful invention. And people said to him, what are you talking about? What do you do with this? It's not going to work. Everybody knows you need to use coins or gems for commerce. And here was a typical Mongol banknote of the time, incomprehensible to the West. Also, it was here that Marco was began to become affected by the Buddhas, the statues of the Buddhas, as well as the monasteries and the actual Buddhist monks who were around the city. He began his journey, and he began life as a very conventional Roman Christian, and had nothing to do with Islam and had nothing to do with Buddhism, and shunned it all. However, that didn't change with Islam, but it did change over time with Buddhism. And as you read through his account, you'll notice how his impressions of Buddhism change from calling it idolatry and dismissing it all as idols to becoming so fascinated with the Buddha and what it represented that he put the Buddha on the same plane, compared him to Thomas the Apostle. Marco Polo has now been adopted by China as an important national figure, and they've begun putting up these huge statues of him, except for Marco Polo, because they feel that he wrote very favorably about China, was a good ambassador, if you will. Although Marco himself never got to Japan, he wrote a lot about it from hearsay, from what he'd been able to learn. And the first mention that Europe ever heard of Japan, which was known as Sepingu in his language, which was just a bad transcription or transliteration of Japan, came from Marco Polo. And it was assumed for a long time that he actually got there, but he never did. He just wrote about it vividly. In those days, people didn't really own manuscripts. Nobility had them in their libraries, and churches had them in their libraries. And this is just sort of an overview of his route. Now, it's funny, you'll often see in books, manuscripts, online, wherever, Marco Polo's route to China. But there's something I have to tell you that I found after a lot of research. Nobody really knows, because it's a conjectural account. Marco didn't write a chronology as you look into his account. He wrote kind of a thematic description of his impressions of one place and then another and then another. It's more like a guidebook than a chronology. On his deathbed in 1324, that's what he said. So as much as there was in his book, we can only imagine the adventures and exploits and people that he left out. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thanks a lot.